Hello, it's Lawrence Romanowski from Calgary, Canada, and Soleil EV Buyer's Guide. The link to this Buyer's Guide, which I've been working on for the last few months, is below. Please have a look at it. This video series is meant to complement the Buyer's Guide. And that what I'm trying to do is take all this new information about e-mobility and electric cars, try to make it sense for the layperson, but also offer something to the person that wants to take a deeper dive into it. Okay, so in this video, this is going to be the most challenging one because it deals with charging the car and AC and DC electricity and the power electronics in the car, and I'll try to make it as easy as possible, but it is kind of confusing, so let's bear with me here and I will do my best. Okay, first, you have to know this if you're going to have an EV, because you need to be able to anticipate how fast your car is going to charge. And if you're on the road, you really want to pick the right charging station, and you really want to predict as accurately as possible, or as accurately as you can, how much power your car can accept and how quickly your car is going to charge, because it'll make your road trip miserable if you can't figure that out and your car doesn't seem to be doing what it's supposed to do. So some time invested in understanding the different ways to charge your car and limitations of your car, and matching the EV with the DC fast charging stations will go a long way to increasing your enjoyment and confidence in your EV, especially for trips. Okay, so let's go through the basics here and bear with me. We have two types of electricity. We have AC and DC. The AC that is in what we call the grid, we have the major power stations which make the electricity. This goes into the high tension wires which run around. The voltage gets reduced. It goes into your home, and every home takes 240. Okay, every home is wired for 240. This gets split into two, so you can either have 240 circuits or you can have 120 circuits. Okay, 120 volt or 240 volt. The 120 circuits are normally channeled through your breaker at 15 amps. You know, the breaker is 15 amps, and the 240 circuits go through your breaker, usually 30, 40, or 50 amps, and those are, you know, the dual 15s or the bigger 50 amp. Okay, so AC is in the grid, AC is in your home, all the electrical outlets in your home are AC, and it's AC at 120 volts or it's at 240 volts. Okay, now AC can't be stored. You can only store DC energy. So anything with a battery is DC. AC and DC aren't compatible. You can't run AC equipment with DC current, and you can't do the reverse. Okay, you can convert AC to DC with a power inverter. So you can convert it, and by doing so, you create some losses and you create some heat. Okay, but you can't run an AC item on a DC. RVs have both AC and DC because they have to run on shore power, which means when you plug them in to your house, or plug them in on your yard, or plug them in at the campsite, they run on AC. And some stuff in the RV will run on AC, but then when you unplug it from the house, you're running on the car battery, and the car batteries are all DC. Okay, so when a RV isn't plugged in, it's running on DC, and oftentimes different things in the RV will only work when it's plugged in. Other things will only work when it's attached to the car or using its own batteries. Okay, so DC you can put in a battery, AC you can't, and that's why there's two kinds of electricity, because some stuff needs to go in a battery. Okay, so confusing things quite a bit are the fact that the electric motors can run on AC or they can run on DC. You can have DC motors or AC motors. They both have different characteristics. It turns out that AC motor is better suited to cars. The AC motor is more flexible. It's more easily modulated. It's more reliable, and it has less maintenance. So that's why that we use AC in automobiles to drive the wheels. DC motors are still used mostly for industrial applications that have a steady RPM, and they tend to be a little bit more efficient at that. But it doesn't really work in a car where you don't want the motor to be like an on-off switch. Okay, so cars have AC motors. All right, so then this car then has a job to do, because when you plug it in at home, it has to take the AC from the home, convert it to DC, and then stick it in the battery. Then when it drives off, it takes the DC in the battery and converts it to AC to work the motors. Under brake regeneration, it takes the AC energy that it recuperates from the kinetic energy of the car and it converts it to DC and puts it in the battery. Okay, so the car is always then taking AC and DC energy and running it through power converters, converting it from one to the other, and managing this, all the while taking some electrical losses and generating some heat in the meantime, which it has to manage. Okay, so and adding another layer of confusion on this is the fact that the architecture of this car can be 400 volt or 800 volt. Well, it could probably be any volt, but they make it 400 volt or 800 volt. And why is that important? And to make any sense of that, we have to look at the basic equation of watts equals amps times volts. Okay, so watts or kilowatts equals amps times volts. Okay, the amps is related to how big the cables are and how much heat it generates. The volts are basically like a stream, how much is going through it. Okay, so with a higher voltage, you can use thinner wires. Thinner wires mean less heat. Less heat means you have less of a job to cool everything, and you can accept more power, everything else being equal. Okay, some EVs are 400 and some are 800, and this affects how the car can change AC to DC and how fast. Okay, it all gets kind of complicated. For AC, we'll get to DC in a moment, but for AC, what's necessary is to figure out the capacity of the car to convert AC energy from the home and put it in the battery. This is done from a power converter or an inverter. They're not all the same. Some cars have a low capacity to convert AC to DC. Let's call it, some cars have as low as 3.6 kilowatts, okay? Some cars have 9 or 10 or 12 kilowatts, and there's some cars like the Porsche has an option to go all the way up to 19 kilowatts, okay? So why is this important? Okay, well, you'd want to match the system in your home, the electrical work in your home, to the capacity of your car. So if your car only has 3.6 kilowatts that it can convert from AC to DC, it doesn't make any sense to put a huge breaker in the wall and be able to pump, 20 kilowatts to the plug if your car will only take 3 kilowatts, okay? So you need to figure out in the car and in the specs, and when you're shopping a car, what is the capacity of AC? Most cars, it's going to be 9 or 10 or 11 for the modern EVs, but that's not to say some of the first generation cars are a lot lower. Some of them will surprise you. Okay, when you find out what the bottleneck is, what the inverter capacity of the car is, or the onboard AC charger, then you can work backward and see how big an electrical service you need to maximize the car's ability to charge the battery. So to cut right to the point, I mean, most installations will use a 50 amp breaker, and that will match the AC onboard charger capacity. Okay, so most of what you need to know is you just need to have a 50 amp breaker. It needs to be installed by a qualified electrician. It needs to be a dedicated circuit. You can't just take an existing circuit from your washer or your dryer and plug it into the EV. The continuous draw that the EV might take might, even if it doesn't trip the breaker, it might overheat the wire, it might melt the plug, it could potentially cause a fire. So you don't want to fool around with this stuff. The way the math works is that Watts equals amps times volts. We know all the houses get 240, so it's 240 volts, okay? And we know that for safety considerations, the electrical code allows you to only use 80% of the amperage. So if you have a 50 amp breaker, you're only allowed to continuously draw 40 amps through it. 20% is a safety margin to make sure that you don't overload the circuit or overheat the wires. So if 50 amp service, 80% of that's 40 amps. 40 amps is usable. Watts equals amps times volts. We know the volts is 240. 240 times the 40 is 9600, is 9.6 kilowatts. And that just happens to be the limit of most new EVs that are for their AC chargers can take up to 9.6 kilowatts and put it in the battery, okay? So you could future-proof your house, stick a 100 amp breaker in it, be able to send 19 kilowatts to the wall, and even if your EV can only take 10 or 11 or 12 at the moment, you know, maybe the next time you get an EV, it'll increase. I know Porsche's an option to go up to 19 kilowatts. The issue with that is that most homes can accept a 50 amp breaker without major expense, okay? And you can time it so that the EV is charged at off peak, not when you're making dinner, not first thing in the morning, not after work. You can get it to charge, after midnight. Some jurisdictions have lower rates after midnight. When there's more EVs on the road, you can be certain that there'll be incentives to charge at night, not during peak hours, to not overload the grid, okay? So with a 50 amp breaker, that's enough to charge an EV at around 10 kilowatts. Even if you're charging the whole battery and it's a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack, that's 10 hours. And 10 hours is, you know, the amount of time you're sleeping usually anyway. So that usually works, and that's kind of maybe the standard of the day is to put the 50 amp breaker in. You use 40 of that. It's 240 volts. You get 9.6 kilowatts at the plug. That matches the 9.6 kilowatt AC/DC inverter capacity of the car, and that takes 8 or 10 hours to fill your EV up from zero. That just seems to make the most sense for everybody, okay? But don't, upgrade your electrical system unnecessarily if your car can't take the power anyway, okay? So that's AC. And now we get to DC, and it gets even a little bit more confusing because we have to deal with this 400 volt and 800 volts confusion. All right, so let's start with that. The more advanced EVs are going to be 800 volt. The Porsche Taycan is 800 volt. The new Hyundai Kia platform is 800 volt. If you go to a higher volt, you can use lower amperage. If you use lower amperage, you can use thinner wires. If you use thinner wires, you've got less heat, and you've got less of an issue for outright performance because the heat that builds up with a really quick discharge of power is considerable, and so you can better manage thermally manage the car with 800 volt. Also, the limitation with the charging cords. If you've ever picked up a 350 kilowatt fast charger cord, they're like that big around. They're liquid cooled, and you can barely lift the thing. At least it takes a lot. Like a small person would have trouble. Small woman or person would actually have a little bit of trouble with one of these things. They're that heavy, okay? So the way to get more power into the car faster is through higher voltage, because you need less amps, and that the root of that is the equation watts equals amps times volts. To bring the watts up, you can either bring the amperage up or the volts up, but if you bring the amperage up, the wires get too big, too heavy, with too much heat, and you can't handle it to handle the cord, and it's too much of a job to get the heat out of the engine, out of the electric motors, okay? So that's why the more sophisticated cars are going to have higher voltage. so they can accept more charge quicker and a better thermal management, okay? Now, that said, there's not that many 800 volt cars. Now, most of the cars out there are 400 volt. Now, for the cars to charge at that maximum, the charging station has to be 800 volt too. And they're not all 800 volt. Even like right now, we've got Petro-Canada 350 kilowatt stations, and we've got Electrify Canada 350 kilowatt stations. You would think they're the same, or they would act the same, but they're not the same, and because they're different voltages. And if you have an 800 volt car or EV, you have to match it to an 800 volt charging station to get the full charge capacity out of it. If you have an 800 volt car and you charge it at a 400 volt station, well, then you have to convert, the car has to convert the voltage from 400 to 800, and that limits the charge rate that it can accept. It gets confusing. So, sorry about that. It gets even more confusing. Some of the cars have optional DC chargers. So they'll have a charger, a standard 50 kilowatt charger like the Porsche Taycan, an optional 150 kilowatt DC charger, okay, which work on 400 volt stations. But then for 800 volt stations, they can get the full, for a Taycan, 270 kilowatts, okay? This is, I know this is confusing. So let's say, for instance, let's just run through a couple of examples. Let's say you have a standard 400 volt car. It will be able to accept DC fast charges at different rates depending on its componentry and the age of the platform, etc. This can vary from 50 to 150 kilowatts. Something like a Chevy Bolt can only charge DC at up to 50 kilowatts, even if it's a 350 kilowatt station. The new 400 volt EVs, let's just say a Volkswagen ID4, I think can charge up to 150 kilowatts, okay, from its 400 volt architecture. So the maximum it can ever get is 125, no matter which charging station it has, okay? So even at the fastest chargers, a Bolt only can take 50, ID4 can take 125. Now a Bolt might have 60 kilowatt hour battery pack. You might be wanting to put in 50 kilowatt hours, okay? And it can accept charge DC at 50 kilowatts. Well, 50 kilowatts into 50 kilowatt hours is 1 hour. That means if you're driving on the road trip and you have a Bolt and it can only accept 50 kilowatts, it's going to take you an hour to recharge the battery no matter what station it is, okay? But if you compare that to a Hyundai, the new Ioniq 5, it can charge at 250 kilowatts. So if you go to a Electrify Canada station with that, then you're charging, you're putting in your 50 kilowatts at 200, sorry, you're putting your 50 kilowatt hours in at 250 kilowatts. It's taking 1/5 of an hour, and you're doing that in 12 minutes. So you've got two EVs that kind of look the same, that might even cost about the same. One drives and it's taking an hour to recharge, the other one takes 12 minutes to recharge. So there's a big difference, and you kind of want to know what your capabilities of the car are. Now the 50 kilowatt for the Bolt is low. Most are 100 or 125 or 150, okay? And so in that case, at they'll be able to put in their 50 kilowatts, 50 kilowatt hours in, maybe a half an hour or something, okay? All right, so the 400 volt EV has the maximum DC that it can accept at any charge station. Some of these fast charge stations are only 50 kilowatts to begin with, so you don't have any choice. Some are 100, 200, 350. It varies all over the place. But the maximum that it can take is either 50 in a Bolt or 150 in like an ID4. All right. If your car is 800 volt, well, then you have the capability of charging at 250, for the Hyundai, or 270 for the Porsche, but only at an 800 volt station. Those are fairly scarce, especially in Western Canada. That's Electrify Canada or Electrify America. So if you go to one of these 800 volt stations, you'll get your 250. If you go to a 400 volt station, even if it's rated at 350 kilowatts, you won't get 270, you won't get 250. And it'll depend on the other onboard electronics that you have. In the case of a Taycan, the standard DC onboard charger is 50 for a 400 volt station. You can upgrade it to 150 for a 400 volt station. But the Taycan that goes to an 800 volt station gets the 270. It's really confusing. So first of all, if you're ordering a Taycan, you really need to get the 150 kilowatt DC onboard charger, okay? And the takeaway from all of this is that when you're comparing EVs, you want to know what the maximum charge rate is AC in the home, and you're going to want to know what the maximum charge rate is DC. You're going to want to know whether you have a 400 volt or an 800 volt EV, and you're going to want to know whether the charging stations are 400 or 800 volt. All this information isn't that hard to obtain, but driving an EV, especially a long range, requires some planning, and those are some of the considerations that you'll need. You'll have certain charging stations which are optimized for your car, and you're going to want to stick to those where possible. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but I did my best to relay that information. And we'll do some more videos on EV. And the next one I think I'm going to do is just how to compare, different EVs that are on the market, and what points are differentiating and what aren't so much. Okay, thank you very much, Lawrence Romanowski. Please like and subscribe, and have a look at the Soleil EV magazine that I've just compiled.